Exactly. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started because this is a hybrid event, so we have the joy of being very punctual for our online audience. But it's lovely to see so many of you, and I hope that you will stay and chat as you are now after the event. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you in person. I think I'm different to welcome you in person and online this evening. My name is Laura Matacoro, and I'm a historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University, which is located on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. And as I think about this lecture series, which is called Rewriting Refuge, thinking about refuge and displacement in different ways, I'm also very cognizant that there are many Indigenous peoples who call Ottawa home, either permanently or temporarily, some of whom have been displaced, either for territorial reasons, but also things like healthcare and the lack thereof. And I'm thinking of many Inuit people who now reside here in the city. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I would like to take a few moments to introduce the Shannon Lecture Series and give a round of thanks. The Shannon Lecture Series, now in its 21st year, is the result of a generous donation by Lois M. Long, who wished to support the department's efforts in the fields of Canadian social, immigration, and local history. Over the years, the series has expanded these themes, all the while staying true to the spirit and generosity of this original gift. This fall's edition, for instance, builds on the series' original focus to elaborate themes of voice and methodology, resistance, borderlands, public history and engagement, and Indigenous histories of place and displacement. For this series, a big thanks goes out to all who have accepted our invitations to participate, some of whom are in the audience tonight. Jean-François Louisier will be speaking next week, so thank you for being here 2 weeks in a row. I also want to thank James Miller, who's here as well, chair of our department, and Dominique Marshall, chair of the Shannon Committee, for all their support and efforts. I especially want to thank Darlene Ross, Tanya Schwartz, and Joan White for all of their administrative support. They have put up with an incredible number of emails from myself at all times of day. And also thanks to Steve Schwinghammer and Sam Mickelson, who are both doing really important doctoral research and who've lent their energies to make this series a reality. The title of this lecture series, Rewriting Refuge, can be read in many different ways. At the core of this series is a desire to ask different questions of the past with an eye to imagining different possible and more hopeful futures. In the online launch event we held a couple of weeks ago, for instance, a roundtable of scholars and refugee scholars discussed the idea of the right to research, and for refugees to be treated as more than subjects of study, but to actually be encouraged to research their own histories, to tell their own stories, and to do so on their own terms in order to transform the world in which we live. It is a profound shift to move from thinking of something as a subject to something as active and engaged. And this is something that Dr. Benjamin Hoy does in really remarkable ways when it comes to the history of the Canada-US border. Indeed, I think one of the places that we need new stories about and a deeper understanding of is the Canada-US border. This past spring, the border was subject to intense scrutiny with the revisions to the Safe Third Country Agreement that limit the manner in which people can seek asylum in North America. Mobility across this border also drew significant attention following the tragic deaths of Casey Oakes of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and 2 families seeking to cross into the United States. Author Robin Maynard has described this border as a grave, while others have seen it as a symbol of hope and opportunity in both directions. Yet borders don't just appear, and they don't just demarcate space, difference, and connection. They too have histories and are bound up with all kinds of beliefs and aspirations. In his Governor General Award-winning work, A Line of Blood and Dirt, Creating the Canada-United States Border Across Indigenous Lands, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, our speaker tonight, Dr. Benjamin Hoy, observes, and I quote, "For all the walls built, treaties signed, and personnel deployed, nation states have never succeeded in making borders their exclusive domain." For those of you who are new to Dr. Hoy and his work, you can find him in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan, where he is an associate professor of history and the director of the HGIS lab. A Line of Blood and Dirt examines the creation of the Canada-US border and its uneven effects on the communities who lived in its shadow from 1775 to 1930, while Dr. Hoy's broader research focuses on digital mapping, game-based learning, and the history of everyday power along the border regions. In A Line of Blood and Dirt, Dr. Hoy insists there's a lived experience in the making of borders, something he describes as, sorry, I'm quoting right in front of you, but here we go. It's a wonderful book, so I couldn't resist. Dr. Hoy describes closures and openings and a deep unevenness to the ways in which the present day US-Canada border has been created, patrolled, and ultimately understood. Crucially, he has described the border as a kind of prism of control, the effects of which have been deeply uneven, resulting in a border that, in his words, has been so trivial to some and so devastating for others. There are many stories to be told about this border, and we are very grateful to Dr. Hoy for being here tonight to share his insights with us. So we look forward to your comments and then the Q&A period that will follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come speak. I promise I came by this topic honestly. For those of you who are PhD students in the room, this was never the project I thought I would do. I was going to be a census historian of all things. And I was going to study transnational mobility. And as I was doing that, I prepared what I thought was a really simple question, which is, how does the Canada-US border work? And that's what this book is. So I never got to my census project. Maybe some point in my life I will finish that work. But I became really curious about why every time I tried to figure out what the border looked like and how it behaved, I got a different answer if I looked in a different place or at a different time. I've hidden my first page. That's always a fun game. Anyways, I'll just sort of quickly begin. I'd like to thank quite a few different organizations who funded this work. Oh, there's my page. So the kind of research that I'm showing you is fairly time-consuming and expensive, and it's really important that you realize that this is not done by one person, that more than 80 people took part in some of this research, especially when we get to the digital mapping. So the funding organizations, but also the graduate students and undergraduates who took part. So I think for many of you, this might be what a border seems to look like. A single line drawn across a map. But to be honest, the Canada-US border has always been a bit of a mess. It was created by thousands of different people, each with their own ideas about what a border should be or what it was meant to represent, where it was intended to go, or who it was designed to keep out. This is the border that we've inherited. It is an unbelievably complicated border. It was drawn, in many cases, by people who knew almost nothing about the landscape that they were claiming ownership over. And it was done over lands that were obviously not empty. So they drew a border that followed largely abstract lines, right? Because you can do those without knowing where rivers run or where mountains fall. They drew a border that largely followed lines of latitude because they lacked the local knowledge to do anything differently. And it gives us a border that looks something like this on paper. But in practice, this is what I think a border looks like. And I realize it's a little bit hard to see the light gray, so maybe I'll describe it. On your right, the big areas of purple are the eastern seaboard of Canada going up into the Maritimes. That sort of line of purple is right down the St. Lawrence. The section of little red dots in the top left corner, that's Saskatchewan and Alberta. And the big red dots are the edge of the United States. So the red is military. The blue is immigration. The green is Department of Indian Affairs. And purple is customs. This, I think, is what a border looks like. And you'll notice how unconcentrated people are along the actual 49th parallel and how deep into each country the personnel are spread. You'll also notice how many gaps there are in this border and how heavy the concentrations are, especially of individual kinds of people. Customs, located almost exclusively on the eastern seaboard and down the St. Lawrence, and is all but absent across the prairies and west coast. The military, or the Northwest Mounted Police, concentrated fairly heavily in the west. Right? This is one of the challenges that I ran into when trying to study this border is you look in a different time or in a different place, and the people who police the border are fundamentally different than in another region. Many of these groups also only interacted with certain kinds of people. Military, especially in Department of Indian Affairs, are primarily interacting with indigenous people. Customs and whatnot are not. And so for different groups, for different times, for different places, for different people, what the border meant was very, very different. And this is the border that we've inherited. So already this is a little bit complicated. But if we toss all of the indigenous territorial divisions on top of that, we're getting an even more complex area. These are lands, these are territories guarded with militaries and diplomatic agreements. And these aren't abstract territorial divisions. These are borders that separate life from death. And to give you a sense of this, I want to tell you a story from the 1860s, when the Cree are facing the threat of starvation. Groups like the Young Dogs Band sent out patrols to the edges of their territory to keep competing groups away from the remaining herds of bison. When the bison disappear from Canada, they take on a new strategy. Instead of protecting existing territorial divisions, they began to make new ones using their military as a point of strength to push into Montana and Siksikapi or Blackfoot territory. The Blackfoot's defeat at the hands of the Cree at Vermilion Hills left stretches of bleached bone. Right? These are borders of territory that determine life and death. So Canada and the United States are attempting to build a border. They're attempting to conceptualize, demarcate, and enforce a new border. But as they're doing this, their goal isn't just to create, it's also to erase at the same time. And Canada, of course, is not stupid. They knew that building a border across lands that already had decades, centuries of borders and other territorial divisions is a difficult endeavor. And as they drew their borders and stationed their troops, they knew that they needed to patrol not one border, but dozens of borders. They knew that the international border was not always going to be the most important border, and the borders between indigenous nations were both easier to patrol and more important to do so. And this map will give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean by this. So it's a little bit hard to see because the gray is sort of hard to see with the lights, but the very bottom of the image is the 49th parallel. And this is Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The red dots are Northwest Mounted Police. The red lines are the patrol routes of the Northwest Mounted Police officers, and the gray squares are the reserves. And you'll notice the Northwest Mounted Police absolutely patrol the Canada-US border, and oddly enough, for reasons I still don't understand, they will cross into the United States with their patrols. I'm still trying to figure out why. But you'll notice that they're not just stationed along the 49th parallel. They're stationed often quite intentionally right next to reserve borders because it's much easier to police those than a border that's 4,000 or 5,000 miles long. Right? That's an almost impossible border to guard, but reserve borders are much easier to control. And if you control movement at its source, if you can eliminate the benefits or increase the hazards of movement, you can stop movements before they even begin, and it doesn't matter how weak your guards are at the 49th parallel. And so what they did was an intense level of control. This is, for those of you who know the history of Canada, following 1885, you have a pass system, and we don't have many records left. The government destroyed most of these over time, but in Saskatchewan, which is where this map is set, we have a handful of passes remaining from the 1880s all the way into the 1930s, and you can map it. And one of the things that it tells you is how much surveillance the government is able to do at the reserve level. So this is showing all of the movements across the plains and every gun that's taken on these trips. So we're not just talking about people, we're talking about what's being brought with them, where they're going, who they're going to see, and how long they plan to stay. And these are not all the movements off reserve, obviously, but it gives you a sense of the level of control in the 1880s, which is a time that the United States isn't even keeping counts in Michigan about how many people are crossing the border. For settlers, we don't even have counts from immigration officials. For Indigenous people, we have not only where they're going, how many guns they're taking, who they're going to see, and for what purpose. So you can see that level of difference in surveillance in the 1880s. And this is why I think the border begins to look very differently at about that time for Indigenous people, especially on the plains. So for those who live in the shadow of this kind of border, these overlapping forms of control create challenges, but they also create opportunities. Long before the border, the 49th parallel, ever came to stop movements outright, it limited one of the most important things, which was the movement of soldiers. It's kind of weird to think about that one of the things you do as a government when you build a border is you restrict your own mobility. From this point and this point further, I'm not sending my soldiers. You might send occasional people, you might kidnap people across the border in clandestine moves, but in general, you don't send soldiers across international lines without the risk of war. And that creates a number of really important opportunities that I'm going to talk about today. But the sanctuary created by this border was never perfect. As I hope this presentation will show, Canada and the United States would expend significant efforts projecting their authority far beyond their national border. And this is, I think, really interesting because they just spent unbelievable amounts of time and energy trying to make that border meaningful. And one of the first things that they do is ignore that very border to project their power deep into the country that they've agreed to create this border with. But as they did so, they're aiming to generate fear, uncertainty, and hardship more often than, say, military control for anyone who attempts to use the border as a shield. So I'm going to give you 4 stories today. 3 stories of large-scale movements. One's movements of the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Cree. And I want to end with a story of an individual, Charlie Williams' quest for love within the borderlands and his challenges to do so. So to give you a sense of 2 different scales at which people sought sanctuary. So in the 1860s and 1870s, persistent hunger, broken treaty promises, and government graft made settler-indigenous relationships on the prairies and in the Great Lakes a volatile mess. In the face of uncertainty, thousands of Cree, Métis, Dakota, and Nimiipuu, as well as Lakota, would seek sanctuary across the Canada-US border in an attempt to escape violence, as well as colonialism of all different kinds. Thousands would make this journey to escape residential schools, government policies, or general persecution. From 1861 to 1865, for example, the Civil War begins to engulf North America. And for the Dakota, it seemed like the United States was falling apart. Animosity grew as settlers, lumbermen, traders, and others violated their agreements. Traders soon stopped supplying goods on credit, exacerbating an already dire situation facing the Dakota. Andrew Myrick, a Minnesotan trader who refused to extend credit, noted, and I quote, "If they're hungry, let them eat grass." Starvation resulted. Amongst this kind of widespread tension and suffering, individual skirmishes risked systemic violence. Robert Goodvoice, who's pictured here, who's a Wampatuan Dakota elder, noted that the violence began in Minnesota when 4 young Dakota men cut through a farmer's field on their way back from hunting deer. The men would get into a skirmish with the farmer who struck one of them with a broom. Humiliated and goaded on by his friends, that man shot and killed the farmer and then killed his family. This kind of event divided the Dakota nation. One side called for war, the other for peace. In the middle of August 1862, Dakota would launch a series of attacks throughout southwestern Minnesota, and both sides would lose hundreds in the violence. In the aftermath of the war, the American government would arrest and try close to 400 Dakota for their involvement in the violence, sentencing 300 Dakota to death in cases that lasted sometimes less than 5 minutes. Abraham Lincoln would commute most of those sentences, but would allow for the execution of 38 Dakota in what was, at the time, the largest mass execution in American history. This is an image of what we're talking about. I mean, 38 people is a lot of people to execute all at one time. The Dakota would flee in all directions. Parents lost contact with their children, and fearing retaliation, the Dakota would move towards the Canada-US border, often traveling by night to avoid detection. This was, of course, not the first experience the Dakota had in this area. Oral accounts by Melvin Littlecrow note, for example, that, quote, "We were always in this country," he's referring to Canada. "At one time back in those days, there was no border. We hunted all over the place, north of the present-day border." Even so, the journey north required substantial perseverance. Lavonna Swenson noted her relative's grandmother took 7 years to travel on foot from the lower Sioux, that is Minnesota, to the Sioux Valley in Manitoba, surviving those years on berries and dried food. During the day, they would, quote, "dig down into the ground and lay buffalo robes over top so that when troops come looking for them, they'd look and they'd see no one and keep going." The lack of border guards at this time, and I showed you that earlier image, that those sort of dots of power, meant that for some it was not until they'd met wagons coming that had a Canadian flag that they knew they were no longer needing to hide. And this is what the border looked like on the plains at the time. These were maybe 2 miles apart. You could imagine it is quite easy to miss the border unless you're looking for it. One of the sort of comical stories is when you put up stones like this, bison have this awful habit of getting real itchy and rubbing against them. And so these markers, even as small as they are, get knocked down and damaged very quickly. They need to be replaced every 10 years or so. So for those who are traveling at night, the flags of merchants rather than boundary stones or soldiers served as the only visible marker that they'd crossed an international border at all. As you can imagine, they're not crossing one border, they're crossing many. According to Robert Goodvoice, one of the attempts to escape the war zone took Tashima into Teton territory. And after a tense encounter, the Teton would provide Tashima family with a tent and supplies, but all, however, was not well. They insisted that his sister marry into their community, and as the Teton tightened their own borders, the place of outsiders became more and more difficult. Eventually, Tashima and his family were once again forced to flee, this time to escape not only the Americans, but the Teton Sioux as well. For the Americans' part, after this violence, cavalry led by General Alfred Sully and Henry Sibley would ambush and slaughter those who remained below the line. Battles at Big Mound, Dead Buffalo Lake, Stony Lake, and Whitestone Hill would leave 350 Dakota dead and destroyed many of their remaining supplies. Those who remained in Minnesota would suffer. Littlecrow, who's pictured here, who was a leader in the conflict, would go north for a time, but would return to Minnesota in June of 1863. He was discovered in early July, by a settler who discovered him while he was picking berries. He shot him and used his body in the town of Hutchinson's 4th of July celebrations. Although hundreds of Dakota would successfully evade the American army by relocating north into British territory, their place in the region remained precarious. In May, Plains Ojibwe killed approximately 20 Dakota in a single raid. Dakota's prolonged stay also put pressure on their relationship with the Cree. Faced with continued conflicts and limited food, the Dakota turned west in search of hunting grounds. In the end, fear shaped movement more clearly than guns or cannons ever could. Around 1875 or 1876, a settler named McKay sought help for his ill wife from the Dakota medicine man, Kupayekta. Thankful for the care he received, he passed on information that he'd learned from a nearby village. McKay told the Dakota that the American government would promise to feed and house the Dakota, but their real goal was to gather the Dakota in one spot, to torture and then kill them. McKay advised the Dakota to flee north where you'll be safe in the lands where there are lots of lakes, fur-bearing animals, and natural resources. And dozens of Dakota families would heed his advice. They would move on foot to Prince Albert, which is located very high up in Saskatchewan. They would move on foot with children as young as 4. By the end of the journey from Minnesota to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, the Dakota had traveled a journey of close to 1,500 kilometers. It's a hard number to understand, but to put that into perspective, that's the same distance as traveling through France, Germany, Austria, and Hungary in a transit from Paris to Budapest. As you can imagine, many of the Dakota who relocated to Prince Albert would not make that journey back home. So despite traveling so deep into British territory, the Dakota never shook their fears of American retribution. There was constant concern that the American army would cross into Canada and, quote, carry them all to the States to punish them for their former misdeeds. And this isn't limited to the Dakota. Dakota, Cree, and Kainai oral histories all describe instances of Americans crossing into Canada to commit violence, or at least persistent fears that the Americans would. And these fears shaped daily life. These fears prevented many Dakota from accepting goods from white settlers out of concern that they might be poisoned. Fears of American interference also manifested themselves in subtler ways, including how the Dakota chose to bury their dead. According to David Pash, his great-grandfather, Pazayedeyapa, evaded American attempts to drag him back to the United States through his life, but would fail in his death. Pash, drawing on stories from his aunties and grandfather, noted that, quote, when he died, the U.S. Army came during the night and paid one of our family members here to show him where his grave was. And they dug up his grave in the middle of the night, and they took his body to New York to display in a museum. As late as 2012, Pash was still attempting to locate his ancestors' remains for repatriation. U.S. military sources confirmed some, but not all of these stories, of the ways, especially, that the American Army would influence Dakota lives from afar, and the clearest example of this is a transnational kidnapping case. So following the violence, Major Hatch attempts to get the rations supplied by Britain to the Dakotas either limited or annulled. He also would hire auxiliaries, and we actually have pay records of this in Minnesota, to kidnap Little Six and Medicine Bottle. And you can imagine kidnapping someone across international lines, especially when sponsored by the US military, can risk some international conflict, but it's far less serious than sending an army of 300 or 400 soldiers to do so. So he's using auxiliaries rather than regulars to get what he needs done. After they're kidnapped and brought to the United States, they're chloroformed and dragged by sled. The United States government says, well, no, we're innocent in this matter. It states it had not authorized Major Hatch's actions, but it has no qualms benefiting from the kidnapping. It convicted the two chiefs of murder and would sentence them to death in 1865. Fun fact, the US Supreme Court decisions will continue this practice. And I was like, surely by the 1930s, they've abandoned this. He's like, oh no. Surely by the 1980s, they will have abandoned this. But they're still kidnapping Canadians for property crimes into the 1880s. This is set down in Supreme Court law. And this is coming out of these earlier cases in the 1860s. So the ramifications of the Dakotas relocation continue long after what I'm talking about. For decades, the Canadian government, every time they get a chance, will describe the Dakota as, quote, American Indians. And while it wouldn't expel the community, it refuses to recognize them for the next 160 years in the ways it will any of the other Indigenous nations in Canada. That changed this year. In 2023, the Whitecap Dakota Nation signed a historic treaty with Canada, which formally recognized them as an Indigenous nation in Canada, with all the inherent rights to self-governance and recognition as an Indigenous people under the Canadian Constitution. That was this year. That should give you a sense of the kind of power and stigma a simple border can create. The Dakotas' relocation across national lines to escape violence would provide inspiration to many other Indigenous communities who are facing impossible situations. 15 years later, the Lakota would make a similar journey north. The Great Sioux War, which lasted from 1876 to 1877, would witness one of the last dramatic victories for Indigenous troops. The Lakota and the Cheyenne would defeat General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, which this painting by Red Horse in 1881 depicts. Custer died, so too did 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry, and as you can imagine, the United States government did not take these losses lightly. Major General Philip H. Sheridan stated that, quote, the Army would make the punishment of the Sioux for the present hostilities one never to be forgotten. American soldiers would drive the Lakota out of their winter camps, exposing those who resisted to starvation, as well as the unforgiving elements. By this point, the United States had learned a very valuable lesson. While it often struggled to defeat indigenous nations in the summer when food was good, it won its wars in the winter when people were struggling. And long before the war officially ended, the Lakota would seek sanctuary in Canada. By the spring of 1887, the Lakota had all but lost the war. And estimates are a little bit tricky, as you can imagine, when there's widespread violence and dislocation. But somewhere between about 3,000 and 10,000 Lakota would relocate to Canada. And whatever the exact amount, the Lakota's migration would create immediate concern. For the Americans, the immediate fear is that the Lakota would simply use the border as a staging ground to launch attacks back into the United States. For the Canadian government, there's fear of the financial, military, and diplomatic implications of having thousands of potentially hostile Lakota in a territory that Canada claimed, but which it had limited control over. Lakota, knowing that their position is precarious, would attempt to make peace not only with the Canadian government, but with many of the other nations in the area. As the Dakota had done before them, the Lakota would emphasize their historic ties to Britain, brandishing medals and other indications of that relationship. They spoke of how they'd always considered themselves British subjects. And the Canadian government is left with very few options. It could try to evict the Lakota, but that's going to be a costly and bloody endeavor, and there's no promise that the weak Canadian military or the Northwest Mounted Police is going to have much success with that. Inviting American troops or British troops into Canada certainly would bolster their chances of success. But you can imagine, for a country that's just been born, right? This is only a decade after Confederation. That is a tough pill to swallow, to call on another military to enforce order in your territory. So that's not looking very good either. But allowing the Lakota to stay creates complications of its own. It threatens to deteriorate relationships with the United States, and it might encourage other groups to use the border in a similar way. There's fears that it will increase the cost to the Canadian government and create problems with the Siksikapi, the Blackfoot, or the Cree, who had not been on good terms with the Lakota for many years. And in the end, the Dominion government will grant the Lakota asylum, but would attempt to control their daily lives. They limited their access to ammunition and refused to grant them any of the rights afforded to Indigenous groups designated as, quote, Canadian Indians. Should the Lakota attack the United States, the government threatened that the wall, the border, will be broken down and the American army will be permitted to cross the line. And they get fairly close to allowing the American army to cross. The main problem is that all the American horses get sick and die in the winter. And by the time the American military is able to sort of recover, the situation is stabilized. So there's a very real chance, at least for a couple months, that Canada might ask the United States for help. But in reality, the Lakota had other things to worry about. They had, after all, crossed many Indigenous boundaries and borders in addition to the international one between Canada and the United States. And like the Dakota before them, they would seek to make alliances, but they failed to make a lasting peace with the Aanin or the Gros Ventre or the Crow, who had controlled the area where the buffalo remain, or the bison. As the bison herds decline, the Lakota find themselves forced to hunt in the United States again. So even though they're moving north of the border for a time for safety, that only works if you're able to maintain your access to food. By 1879, starvation had forced them to consider wintering south of the line, despite all the dangers that it brought. And as they do so, they suffer raids from the Aanin, the Crow, the Cheyenne, and they remain in constant fear that the US military will find and destroy them. But even when they're in Canada, they don't remain outside of the American sphere of influence. In that sense, their experience shared a lot in common with the Dakota before them. The international line curtailed the movement of American soldiers, but never their ability to affect daily life. In 1879, for example, General Miles would detain 1,000 Métis and 800 carts because he suspected them to be assisting the Lakota. Traders continued to sell munitions and arms to the Lakota, but Miles' actions would raise the stakes of this kind of work. Being a friend with the Lakota now became a liability. And by 1877, hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty had forced the last remaining holdouts in Canada to surrender to the United States. And for those of you who are thinking, well, Canada is a sanctuary and that's a story I know, I want to tell you a final story at sort of the national level. Canada is not innocent of the kinds of violence I've just described. While Canada has long taken pride in being a sanctuary for those fleeing violence, it would also instigate violence so severe that it forced the Korean Métis to flee across an international border in the opposite direction. Following the 1885 resistance, Canada, for example, tried more than 80 Indigenous people, including One Arrow, Poundmaker, Big Bear, and Whitecap. Many received jail sentences up to 7 years in a series of cases that were at times little more than shams. The Minister of Justice demanded convictions, and lawyers confused by Cree names failed to keep track of who was even under trial. In the end, Canadian courts gave preference to expediency and political pressure over justice. A person's presence, rather than their actions, served as sufficient evidence of their guilt. It's worth noting that the Cree have a very different relationship in the Northwest Resistance than the Métis. While there's certainly a handful of people, including Wandering Spirit, who took part in acts of violence, key leaders like Big Bear and Poundmaker advocated policies of peace. And despite Big Bear's stance, Canadian courts would sentence him to a prison term that proved little better than the gallows. He grew sick in prison, was prematurely released, and died shortly thereafter. In the aftermath of war, thousands of Métis and Cree would flee to the United States, where they drew on family members for support. And the decision to relocate took a pretty substantial psychological toll, especially for those who lost contact with family members in the process. Little Bear, or Imsees, and Little Poplar took 200 Cree, many of them followers of Big Bear, to the United States in a trip that entailed great hardship. They traveled 400 miles with family members while lacking both provisions and sufficient horses to do so. And the relocation faced many hurdles. In 1895, the United States government, Congress, appropriated $5,000 to rid the country of, quote, the Canadian Cree, arguing they violated American gaming laws and had become a general nuisance. Congress believed that Canada alone should be responsible for rectifying this difficult situation. And during 1896, the American military would deport Little Bear, Lucky Man, and 523 Indigenous people, all believed to be Canadian Cree, by force back to Canada. And while the American military had promised the Canadian government had granted the Cree amnesty, the Northwest Mounted Police officers immediately arrested Lucky Man and Little Bear as soon as they were delivered across the border. The Canadian government would later drop these charges, but by that point, the damage was done. By the turn of the century, most of the Cree who had followed Lucky Man and Little Bear would return to Montana, despite the hardships that they had faced. Over the next 2 decades, Little Bear continued to push for land. In 1916, almost 30 years after the resistance had driven him from his home, Little Bear found a permanent home for his people on the Rocky Boy Reservation in Montana. For the Cree who remained in Canada, the situation had become almost unmanageable. Canadian soldiers, for example, confiscated all the knives, axes, and guns they could find on the Little Pine community, even though that community didn't take part in the resistance. In the years that followed, that community possessed so few knives that when you were doing basic kitchen chores, multiple families would have to share a single knife amongst them. Disease, malnourishment, mistreatment, unhappiness, and assimilation policies also created tremendous suffering. 4 years after the resistance, only about half the population at Crooked Lake and File Hills remained. The final story I want to tell you is at a different scale. While the first 3 stories were these sort of macro scales of large-scale movements involving hundreds of people, what I want to emphasize is that's not all of the movements that are entailed. The final story I want to tell you occurs at a much smaller scale. This isn't a story about governments or armies. This is the story of a single family, their love for one another, and their hope for a better life. So in 1902, Charlie Williams, who's a member of the Tulalip Reservation in Washington, would attempt to divorce his wife, Louisa Williams. The courts, however, wanted no part of this. They denied the divorce on the grounds of a lack of jurisdiction, and when they did so, he ignored their ruling and would start a new relationship with Cecilia Joshua and would leave for Canada. For the next decades, William Williams and Joshua would make short jaunts from British Columbia back into Washington State 3 times a week to peddle clams at Friday Harbor, which is pictured here. These kind of movements, as you can imagine, carried a pretty substantial risk. The couple, at least according to the American government, had violated bigamy laws, right? He had married while already married because his divorce hadn't gone through. In addition, and maybe more problematic for the American government, the couple had brought a child with them that had previously been enrolled in residential schools. Indian agents on both sides of the border attempted to track the couple down, and in a close call would capture the couple's boat and all their supplies, but failed to bring them into custody or to return the child to school. While neither government could control the couple's mobility, they were more than capable of destroying their well-being. 6 years after the couple had first left for British Columbia, the situation had become untenable. In 1908, Williams, his health failing, declared he was, quote, he was going to come home even if he had to die for it. By that point, the couple was in their mid-50s, and sending a message through family members to the Indian agent, they agreed to turn themselves in. Williams was arrested on his return to the United States, and a child named Foster Sam was once again enrolled in the residential school. Williams never gave up on his attempt to divorce or his attempt to find love outside what American courts and Indian agents prescribed. And Charlie Williams and Cecilia Joshua's story shows, I think, some of the intricacies that go into making borders. At no point was either country able to stop them from moving back and forth across the line, even 3 times a week. It's not like it's a one-and-done situation. At no point was either country able to stop the couple from cohabitating, crossing the border, or even avoiding prosecution. But border guards had a different kind of power, and that was a power that made the border sting all the same. Exile added so much psychological and financial hardships that they eventually became more significant than the domestic punishments that awaited Williams back in the United States. And what I hope you'll take from each of these stories is how uneven the border's impact is. Crossing the border for a sanctuary was never a one-time decision. Little Crow would cross and recross the border before his execution by vigilantes. The United States expelled the Cree only to find they had returned back to the United States. Williams would cross back and forth dozens of times throughout his life. Nor did the border act much like a barrier at all. At no point did either country stop any of these communities from crossing the line, whether they were traveling with hundreds of people, dozens of people, or as individuals. They failed to stop almost any of the transits as they're in progress. Where they found success was instead in undercutting the supports that allowed each community to remain across the line. This took many different forms, including surveillance on reservations, hassling Métis traders who supplied the Lakota, taking the knives, axes, and guns away from anyone they thought might be connected to the violence, and making it a liability to be friends with those deemed to be living in the wrong country. And it's worth noting that throughout all of this, neither Canada nor the United States limited their authority to the territory that they claimed as their own. American auxiliaries would kidnap Little Six and Medicine Bottle on Canadian soil, leading to their execution. American collectors would travel hundreds of miles north into Canada to bring Indigenous remains back to American museums. Rumors of American machinations created so much fear that Dakota refused to take aid even when 350 miles north of the border. Canada's false promises of amnesty helped to justify an expulsion necessary to bring the Cree back to Canadian soil for trial. And despite all of this, the Canada-US border is only one of the borders that matters to these stories. Finally, while it's easy to focus on large episodes of violence and the ways it pushed people across international lines, I hope that the final story indicates that this is only a small part of a much larger picture about the ways that borders could create sanctuary. As Charlie Williams' Exile suggests, refusal to recognize divorces, as well as coercive Indian policies in residential schools, as well as hundreds of other factors, pushed people across international lines as they attempted to build better lives. Unfortunately, these kinds of mobilities are far harder to rebuild and quantify. got a sort of final quotation here. This is by James W. Walsh, who's a Northwest Mounted Police officer. And this is what Canada imagined the border would be. He imagined that for Indigenous people, that the border would be something that they feared to touch, lest their rashness bring grief to them and their people. That would serve as an imaginary wall higher than sight can reach and thicker than shot can pierce. And the border never became that kind of illusory monster that Walsh imagined. But by the 19th century, it had nonetheless become a crucial tool for remaking landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoy. That was a fascinating presentation. There were so many visuals, I think, that we could think through with the mapping that you were doing, but also just the multiple scales. And you had this line about how easy it is to miss the border if we're not looking for it. And then you offered us these stories with many, many borders that we wouldn't know to look for in some instances. So thank you so much for an incredible presentation. We have lots of time for questions, comments. I have a handy mic. You could all come up to the podium if you like, but there's also this traveling mic. And we would just ask you to introduce yourselves and feel free to make comments. Is anyone feeling brave? I might go to the Zoom question then. We'll have a competition between our online audience and our in-person audience. So for those of you on Zoom, do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box at any point, and I'll just go back and read it. Sorry, very awkward. All right, so the question is, the questioner says, thanks for a fascinating presentation. Can you please speak about the archival sources used for this work and share any challenges you faced for access to these sources? Probably a question a lot of us in the room have as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to really preface this that this is not something that one person does. I think that's the first most important thing, especially for the graduate students in the room. If you read my dissertation, it sucked. It's not good. It's not well written. It doesn't have any of the maps. It has none of the oral histories. Like none of the things that I think people like the most about my work was in my dissertation. So I think that's the first thing that I'll say is I struggled a lot with changing scales. It required visiting maybe 30 different archives and looking at records that were as varied as oral histories and personal diaries, all the way up to the driest, most horrible records that you can imagine. Just charts of people and where they were located, just reams of it. And I think the biggest or most surprising challenge I ran into is how unusable most 19th century diaries are. I had this really wonderful idea that, you'd go to the archive, and those of you who looked at archival collections, they often give you this wonderful description of a person's life when the material is accessioned. And it will say, their family, some of them went to Canada, some of them went to the United States, and they kept correspondence throughout their life, and on this day, they found out that their son died in the Civil War, and they're living in Canada. I was like, this diary is just going to be amazing. And so you open the diary, and there's boxes of them, like 6 boxes of diaries that someone has painstakingly saved their whole life. And you open them, sunny, okay, fine. Windy, sunny, it's like only weather. Their whole life, they meticulously kept this. Someone kept this. Someone thought it was worth bringing to the archive, and it's just weather. And that just like broke my heart, because I went through hundreds of these diaries just desperate to find one, and I finally found one by this amazing woman named Gracia Countryman, who is a librarian from Minnesota, who's the only person I've ever seen who talks about border crossings gone well. And I think that's one of the challenges. I talked about all these border crossings or these challenges, right? Moments of rupture, moments of violence. But trying to find someone who writes just like normal shit about their day is like really, really hard. And so she's crossing this border, and she is forced to pay like 35 cents for a rug that she's bringing or something like that. And she, for whatever reason, bless her heart, writes it in her diary. And then she's like, oh no, I got delayed. It was like kind of a disaster. We couldn't make it to the town we were supposed to because it took an extra hour at the border. So we just got this different hotel or whatever, and we woke up and it was all great, and I ate strawberries and whatnot. And so I think that's one of the hardest parts for me about history, is rebuilding what the normal is. You often see the aberrations or the problems or the other things, and no one writes normal stuff in their diary. And most of that work I found actually through correspondence. So for the graduate students in the room, correspondence can be that place where you find people describing their everyday life, their everyday struggles, their concerns that may not actually turn out to be manifested. And that surprised me, and so it sort of changed how I did research. And that was sort of one challenge, and the other challenge is at the other end, which is how do you deal with enormous data sets? And I failed in my PhD to do that. And then I got $80,000 from Shirk and hired 10 people, and suddenly I could work on a different scale. And so, for those of you who are interested in telling big histories, just know that it's not done by individuals, it's done by teams. And one of the sort of side effects of that is, if any of you need anything in my book, all of the data sets are available for free online. Every Indian agent is mappable, Army, Northwest Mounted Police. I will show you how to use them. Please use it. Please do not do it the hard way like I did. But I think you'll find that the people who do those bigger histories want to share, so that the work has to be done once.
I really appreciated the point you just made about how hard it is to write a history of the normal. And in your earlier slides, you have these incredible webs of power. Is that, and the power seems to be both crossing the border, but also connected to the border. Yeah. Oh, there are many of them. That one was especially striking, I think, as you were showing us the different borders. And I guess I wonder about, like, is this what normal looks like? And can you tell us a little bit about how you know that that's what normal is?
Yeah, so this map is a bit of a lie. This is the really frustrating thing about trying to do big histories. So basically what you're seeing, those red dots, are essentially mailing addresses. And humans have this really awful habit of not staying put. And when you're trying to map 700 people's daily movements, like they don't always write down where they go. I know that the thin red lines are their patrol routes in theory. But that doesn't mean they did them every day. That doesn't mean, even trying to figure out how often they sent patrols along each route, I've not been able to rebuild. I can find pieces of it where I know along between these two sections they sent X number of people every 2 weeks, right? And you could map that as an interactive map where you can see like little dots moving back and forth. But trying to do that even at a scale of the prairies, even over 1 year, it's really, really hard to find consistent enough records that are expansive enough that you can do this. And the work that I'm working on right now is sort of really underlines this. For whatever foolish reason, I decided to map US Army infrastructure, subsistence networks. Like, how does the Army get its food? One of the things in this book that I realized was that the Army seemed to be way less effective than I thought it would be. It was really, really powerful during times of war, right? As you saw, I hope, during this presentation, but during times of peace, it seemed sometimes to matter, and like for years at a time to be mostly absent. And I was really curious why. And I think what's happening is the Army is not being supplied properly. It has some of the worst water you might imagine. Like, we're talking yellow water or orange water that's a mixture of beeswax oil and engine rust from the pumps that they're bringing in. One of the forts that they build after the Battle of Little Bighorn just has such bad water. Like, we're talking water where dead animals are being dumped into it, that there's just endless waterborne illnesses so bad that they eventually shut down the post. So one of the questions I had is, well, maybe that's why the Army seems to matter only some of the time. But they're also doing things like farming, because the government's not giving them enough money for food or forage, and so they're spending their time chopping wood and growing food and carrying water in pails sometimes, or by horse and wagon. And so I'm trying to rebuild that sort of daily life because it seems to matter, I think, to the story that I'm seeing here, where the army, like I said, capable of enormous amounts of power and violence in these discrete moments, and then seems to sort of fade and disappear. And that, I don't think, ever gets reflected in a map like this, right? Even if a patrol is supposed to be sent out, if that person's farming that day, for the lived reality of the people at that time, that's really hard to rebuild as a historian. And that's sort of the frustrating part of all of this, is you only get half the cards if you're lucky. So these maps are simplifications, I guess, and I wish I could do better.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Amy. I'm from Carlton. Um, anyways, I was kind of curious I mean, there's many comments running through my head right now, but I'm curious to hear first about the Jay Treaty and how that factors into your research and whether there's anything similar to it across the prairies. Because, I mean, my understanding of colonial borders is that it was placed on top of existing borders, as you said. So, you know, the fact I'm not quite convinced that various nations would even follow colonial jurisdiction. And then second, I wonder how late your research goes, because I look at this map and I see the surveillance, and I'm just kind of shocked that there's been, you know, no data or information to trace something like, you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So those are the kind of things that are running through my head right now.
Yeah, so the Jay Treaty is a really interesting piece. That takes on a really weird significance in 1924 of all years. So 1924, the U.S. passes two important policies that have nothing in common. They're never supposed to interact. One is to grant all Indigenous people citizenship with very specific language. And the second, what's the second one? The second is an immigration policy that says something along the lines of, you have to be able to become a citizen under these very specific circumstances. And the book does a better job of describing this. But those two pieces interact in a really convoluted way, so that Canadian Indigenous people are being prohibited from crossing the border because they don't fall under the 1924 Citizenship Act for Indigenous people. And so by that boundary, they become excluded from immigrating under the Immigration Act. So these two policies, created by different people at different times, coalesce in this really awkward way. And so the Jay Treaty and its provisions get called into question, and this goes to the courts. And this is Paul Diabo, who's a Mohawk ironworker, who brings this forward. The Mohawks are moving all across the United States from Canada to work in these high-paying jobs, and by every other marker should be able to immigrate for work. They have enough money, they meet all the other requirements. But because of these two pieces, they run into challenges. And so this becomes, I think, the moment that the Jay Treaty begins to take on the kind of significance that you'd recognize today, where it gets fought in the courts and the Mohawk win. And in the aftermath of that, the Department of Immigration, who's had a really awkward relationship with Indigenous people this whole time, same with Customs. But one of the questions is, which department controls this? Is it Department of Indian Affairs or Department of Immigration? Is it Department of Indian Affairs or Department of Customs? And there's this really sort of awkward overlap. And for many years, none of those organizations want to bring this before the court because they don't want to hear the answer. They'll sort of take people to court, they'll hassle people, and then they'll back off because no one's sure what the result is going to be. And so in 1924, that begins to change. And then the new question becomes, who is Indigenous? Do you have to have status? What about the Métis? What about all of these? Like, you can imagine there are thousands of ways that you can spin this, and so that becomes the new question. And that's what gets fought in the courts afterwards. So that's, I guess, my quick answer for, when we're talking about the West and across Canada, I think 1924 is the sort of landmark year where the Mohawk win this case that has ramifications for all of Canada and the United States. In terms of mapping other things like missing and murdered Indigenous women, the actual mapping is easy. I can teach you to map in 2 weeks, any of you. I have a course, it's online, please use it. I'm happy to send you one. It's getting the data that's hard. that's the fundamentally difficult thing. Like something like this is something that you could put together in half a day if you had the data. The data is fundamentally the hard part. And as you learn to map, you become more and more frustrated with what you're able to map. And I think that's sort of the challenge. So if you knew where people were taken, for example, that would be a very simple map to do. If you knew their birthplaces, that would be a simple map to do. All that would look like behind the scenes, behind this map, would be a name, maybe a nation or a community that they're from, and a latitude, longitude coordinate that you could pull from Google Maps if you had to. So I think the challenge is the same challenge that all researchers face, which is, how do I know that I've gathered enough information, that this information is reliable and expansive enough? The mapping is at the end for you to show, or at the start for you to help yourself understand the patterns that you're seeing. But I think it's worth not getting lost in the mapping, because I think that's fundamentally one of the easiest parts of this kind of work. It's the getting the information that I think is one of the hardest.
Is this on? I'm Daniel Ruck, Department of History at University of Ottawa. Thank you so much. I am sad for the people who really like censuses that they didn't get this work done. But the border is, you can see in your work, you prove it, that the border is this really rich place from which to view a whole pile of other things and to do an analysis based on the border. The border, when an ordinary person thinks about the border, in some ways you can't think of a more neutral kind of topic where the border represents kind of nothing, or represents the in-between, between the extremes. And yet what you're describing is the border is at the center, and the border is, as the stories you're telling a normative story. The story you're telling, all the stories you're telling have right and wrong built into them, so they're not neutral. They're very much about normativity and morality. And so I think the question I have is about, like, where does that fit in? Because in many ways, the stories you're telling, you're taking the sides of the people who now we consider to be oppressed, who consider to have the indigenous people had their land taken away. Settlers at the time saw them as terrorists, savage, committing massacres, being the children of darkness when they were the children of light. They were the civilized ones. And so those narratives are there. You're telling the opposite story. You're telling those people's story against the stories that were being told at the time by settlers. The people who experienced that at the time would be the settlers who were very afraid of indigenous people, who wanted to massacre the indigenous people, who wanted to take away their land, would be really unhappy with your narrative, right? And I think that's one of the values of the story that you're telling. But I wanna push a little bit to be like, what is, because that's not really your focus, but how does the narrative of normativity, morality, of right and wrong fit into your story? And the second part of that question is about how is this story about the border, and how is it about the nation state? And because in many ways what you're talking about is the construction of nation states that have the kind of borders that we're now used to, but that were brand new at the time. So that's a two-part question.
Yeah, these are amazing questions. So maybe I'll start with the second question first, which is, I think this is, like you say, a story about building nations. One of the first things that modern nation states do is they have to designate territory. This is the extent of my laws. This is the extent of my militaries. This is my extent of all of these things. And in practice, it's messy. But I think you're right that this is, as much as anything, the story about building nations. And one thing that I found that surprised me was how much a border matters to the creation of a nation. It's not just this abstract line. So today our government's funded by income tax. In the 19th century, it's funded by customs and tariffs. You don't have a border, you do not have a government. Right? This is the border that pays for everything. And so if we go back to this map, the purple is the area that's easiest to guard. It's the first thing that they build, because for every customs agent they hire, they get 4 or 10 times that money back in the amount of money that they bring into the government. And so that's why you see, we could go back earlier especially, it's just lit up with purple. And the border that they initially care about is not the 49th parallel, right? It's the borders with Europe, right? Because large ports are really easy to control. Ships can only land at certain places, so you just have to station your person there. And they're along the Atlantic Ocean and deep into the St. Lawrence River. And so I think the question is, that's an easy border to guard. That's the first one that almost every nation will if you're going to rely on customs and whatnot. Patrolling people is the opposite. You're bleeding out money that you could be spending on building canals or anything else the government might want to do. And so I'm really interested at the moment that they choose to guard people and monitor people instead of just goods. And so that's when you start looking at especially immigration, which, like I said, for settlers will lag into the 1880s, sometimes until World War I before they start taking that more seriously. But will begin much earlier for Chinese immigrants in the 1880s and indigenous people in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, etc. So this is where some of that unevenness comes in, because it's really expensive. And so a lot of the policies that we inherit are built to keep certain specific groups of people out, and that will filter into their understanding when they eventually apply it to women and then to settlers in general. In terms of your first point, it is true that certainly the governments at the time would have disagreed with my assessment, no question. But at least in the book, and certainly not in this presentation, I tried to show what the border meant to hundreds of different people. I think that's one of the things that was really important to me, and one of the reasons I changed scale a lot is even for people from the same community, this border really treated people differently. For some, they were asked to cross the border because their health had failed and they believed that Canadian air was fundamentally better than American air. Right, that the dry prairie air would soothe their asthma and their other ailments. There are thousands of reasons that people cross this border. And I think that's one of the challenges to writing this story is people have very, very different views on this. You know, I think what attracted me to this topic, I guess going back to your first question, is I'm really interested in stories of power. And I find it really hard to sort of lump myself in with political history or Canadian history or Indigenous history or any of these fields, because if you're interested in power, you need to understand at least a little bit about all of these things. And especially with something like the border, you can't just choose immigration or customs. I wish I could, would have made this a lot easier. But I think it's, once you sort of stack different layers on top of each other, I think you can start to get this sort of logic that goes behind the power that's being exercised. And like I said, I think you're right that many of the people would disagree with my assessment, and I don't have a problem with that. I think in most cases I've tried to represent the position as fairly as possible, but even at the time, especially with the Department of Immigration, the people during the time period would have disagreed with some of what they're doing. They lie in their records, for example. They disobey orders. They falsify deportation records. So one of the examples is when they're deporting people, they ask something along the lines of, are you excited to see your family again after we deport you? And if you answered yes, they said you voluntarily left instead of were deported. So you're dealing with these sort of garbage records. Even at the time, that would have been seen as questionable. Then the head of immigration gets in trouble for this. So some of what I'm describing, I guess, is things that would have been problematic at the time, and some I think they would have agreed with. But one of the sort of lessons that I've learned from this history is if you're ever given control over someone else's life, there is an enormous responsibility that I think both Canada and the United States didn't treat as seriously in the 19th century as I hope we would today. Because I think a lot of the challenges you see aren't even necessarily from malice, although they come from that. Some of them is from a deep, profound belief that you are doing the right thing. And some of the worst devastation, like residential schools, come from that self-assuredness, I think.
There's one question online, and then we'll go to Helen. So a question of a very different order from Steve Schwinghammer, who asks about if and when you see a relationship between the Canadian Immigration Service and the US Immigration Service in the late 19th century and maybe what they were getting up to.
Yeah, so one of the surprises, I guess, when you start mapping things is you realize that you're often reading back things that you think that are true today that you think should be true in the 19th century but aren't. And one of them had to do with how many border guards they're stationing along the US-Mexico border and how many along the Canada-US border. For a very long time, it's the same number of people, with a caveat. The Canada-US border is almost twice as long as the US-Mexico border, so they are stationing more per mile. But in terms of overall investment, they're not necessarily investing all that much more along the south than in the north. But there are a ton of interesting variations, and you can see, especially on this map, the red. If the US military was being used to guard the Canada-US border, they were doing a terrible, terrible job, right? They're nowhere near it. Like lots of these organizations are nowhere near the border, right? This is about guarding Indigenous borders, like fundamentally. That's the borders that they're guarding. That's why they're spread out all throughout the United States. And that, I think, is part of that process of erasure that they're very consciously doing, right? This is a policy of control. And if you control people in, say, South Dakota from being able to leave the reserve, then you don't need to guard that long international line that's almost impossible to guard. And that's why you see this sort of weird shape that you're seeing here, is they're not dumb, right? These are very intelligent people who are trying to control thousands of Indigenous nations who are quite strong and powerful throughout the 19th century.
Helen from Carleton. I had a question about the language that you used in your presentation.
Sure.
You talked about Canadian Cree, and I think you said American Mohawk. And I'm just wondering if the Canadian and American designation is that for our benefit to understand North-South movement, or is that language that's used in the sources when the border was created?
Great question. So that's language used in the original sources. So when the Dakota are in, when the Cree are in the United States, they're described as the Canadian Cree. Especially the Dakota are described always as American Indians. And that's very, very conscious. And this doesn't happen just after the violence. This happens decades, many decades later. And that's a stigma that the Dakota live with for the next more than 100 years, where they're being denied benefits and services to lands that they previously had hunted in. Because once the borders are made, I guess one of the most important reasons you create a border initially is so that you can not double pay Indigenous nations for land, right? Below this line, Americans are signing treaties. Above this line, Canadians are signing treaties. And they're very, very worried that people will double dip and agree on treaties with both nations. And so, especially in the 19th century, less in the 20th century, they're very consciously trying to divide people so that they have one and only one home. And you can imagine for a group whose family is split by the border, that doesn't make any sense, right? And as you saw when the Métis and the Cree are crossing the border, they're visiting family, right? These aren't like random movements. And the same with the Dakota, like they know these lands, right? And I think that complicates our idea about a refuge and sanctuary. What does it mean when you're relocating within your own homeland or within your extended lands or lands that you know? I think that's one of the challenges to our sort of conception of borders is there are many other ways to imagine territory rather than these rigid nation states with extremely precise borders. It's not even how Europe used to do it. That's sort of a relatively new thing, new historically, it's hundreds of years old now. But there are other ways, like zones of control, that as you go further away from your military power, your control gets less and less and less, but that leads to overlapping jurisdictions. And this kind of idea about borders, right, it doesn't allow for overlapping belonging or overlapping jurisdictions, even though, as I hope I showed, those still remain. Just in theory and on paper, they're imagining something new.
Back with another online question, which is really very, very precise. So I'm actually going to read instead of ad-libbing, as I usually do. And so the question is, how do you confront the irony of the situation where the invasive surveillance of people produce data that are essential for historical studies, But the freedom from that surveillance means people's lives are unrecorded and therefore invisible to historians.
Yeah. So I actually built a game to try and teach this. This is one of the fundamental challenges in history, right? You are left with only a portion of the deck that's needed to understand. And so the first game that I ever built was a game centered around Puget Sound. So this is BC-Washington border and the smuggling records. And so as the people in the game, you get a hand of cards that are real goods that people brought across the border, and you can either bring them in or you can smuggle them, and the game changes over time as Chinese exclusion intensifies. And you play the game, and in theory, if everyone in my class was law-abiding citizens, no one would smuggle, right? A bunch of criminals. As you can imagine, oh, your score is published every round. And so people read out their scores, and it'll be like 2, 4, 6, 37, 2. And everyone's like, what? 37. And the next round happens. 30, 40, 60, 40, right? Everyone begins to smuggle. And the idea is to give people a chance to experience an actual system, right, based on archival records. But at the end of the game, one of the questions that I ask is this is based on archival records from customs officials, is this accurate? And the answer is absolutely not. It'd be like me evaluating universities by only looking at students who failed the courses. But if you're a smuggler and you get caught by customs, you suck at your job, right? By definition, you have failed at your job, right? And that's one of the challenges. That's why I wanted to tell the story about Charlie Williams. It's one of those few moments that you can see at a different scale that's, I think, almost always lost in these stories. You see these big moments of rupture, but these smaller stories only exist in fragments and only for a handful of people. And I think we're missing, I think those stories are much more common than the bigger stories that are easier to tell. So it's a wonderful question, and I think it points at one of the biggest limitations facing our profession is there are a lot of silences that we can suspect are not there because nothing was created, or that because nothing happened. That they're there because nothing was created, or that survived for one of 100 reasons. Like, I'd love to be able to put a full past system thing that changes over time, but they destroyed almost all the past records. And so the map that I was able to show you is one of the only sort of regions and areas that I can show you a taste of what you can imagine across a much wider geography.
Doing such a phenomenal job of answering questions. We're starting to wind down on time. I wonder if there are any more questions in the room. I know there's another one online. I will say that your last answer is very much a reminder of how important it is to be not only critical but creative, right, in terms of how we approach, our research and the records we work with. So, any questions in the room? Otherwise, I'm going to go back online. Michelle, I thought you might have a question.
And thank you, Michelle Hogue, Carleton. I have some students I'm going to ask on their behalf, since they're dutifully, some of them probably here, some working at home, watching it on Zoom, working on an essay that looks at some of your book, but also the way, some of the sources that you use in your book, particularly scholars of Asian exclusion and the histories of border enforcement around immigration. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to unite those topics. I think in the middle of your book, where you talk about immigration or the border enforcement around the Pacific coast and the way that it operates for migrants from coming from Asia, and as well as indigenous peoples. And you talk about the decision to put those two topics that the scholars have talked about in various ways, but often in isolation from one another. So what was your goal in terms of uniting those sort of formerly disparate conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that was not something I ever wanted to do, and that was born mostly out of failure. As you can imagine, adding more work, learning a new field, right? Like it's a huge field. There's enormous amounts published. It's really, really vibrant. And it's really hard to grasp when you're also trying to get customs and immigration and Northwest Mounted Police across 3 regions, across 150 years. Like adding more work to your plate is not something you want to do. And so it's not something I ever thought I was going to do. And I think I was lucky that I did my PhD in California, which was very much engaged with those debates. And so I was very lucky that I was doing my PhD around the time that Beth Lou Williams, who's this wonderful award-winning historian, read her work if you want to know about Chinese exclusion, was doing her work, and she was beginning to think about some of the ways Indigenous people were involved. And so I got very lucky that sort of someone a few years ahead of me was thinking about those things, and that many of the scholars around me were talking about Chinese exclusion. And the more that I did research, the less and less I was convinced that the story I was initially trying to tell was the one that mattered. And eventually I decided, I was like, the story doesn't make sense without Chinese exclusion. It's such a big part of justifying the border in the Pacific. It's a big reason that customs is expanded. Like all of the things I was interested in weren't being driven by the things I was seeing on the plains, right? Violence with Indigenous people drives the plains and decisions to enforce the border, but that's not the case in BC. I think Chinese exclusion, among other things, is what drives that story. And so I guess, especially for students, remain sort of flexible. I think if you read my dissertation proposal and then you read my dissertation, they have nothing in common. There is zero overlap. All the stuff on the census became an 80-page appendix. None of it made it into the book. And I think some of that is, I try and start with interesting questions. Why does this border form? And then you pick up the skills or the techniques or the literatures you need to explain that. In this case, it was, I think, Chinese exclusion that I thought was the most convincing reason to see the patterns in the border there. But I was maybe naively reluctant for a really long time. And it just, I couldn't figure out any other way that this made sense without expanding the topic. And the same is true for the time period. I'd never wanted to go that many years. I had this really wonderful, tight PhD topic. It was 40 years long. I was going to go 1775 to like 1915. It was perfect. But none of it made sense, right? So I had to go back to 1775 to sort of explain how the border formed. And then the ending point, I thought World War I was going to be the point, but I think it's more like 1930s that the story I was telling actually ended. And so I tried to remain as flexible as I could to follow the story and start and end where it did and try and trace it, even if it meant learning other fields that, like I said, added a lot of work and time.
All right, last call. Okay, so there's one more question from Zoom, which is about the environmental diaries that you mentioned. So we had Alan McEachern here in the winter talking about, for the other Shannon Lecture Series that happened this year, talking about ordinary people mapping meteorology. And so the question is about, is there something that could be done with those diaries in terms of, maybe this is another field that you want to add to your cachet of fields. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there is a really fascinating environmental history of the border. I mean, animals, for example, have this awful habit of not giving a shit what we think. And the best story that I have of this is in the 1880s, the salmon refused to cross into Canada for whatever reason. They just decide one year, we're not crossing the border. And you can imagine, right? For Canadian fishermen, this is like a career-ending problem. And so unsurprisingly, all of them decide to cross the border. And they fish like they had always fished. They need these fish for their livelihood. And American customs agents decide to start just arresting everyone. And this creates this huge international incident. Britain gets involved, Canada gets involved, and for that year and that year alone, they extend the border 1 or 2 miles to the south so that Canadian fishermen can take part. So like, these are the kinds of practical changes that you have to make because the natural world doesn't always care about the lines that we draw. And you see this across all different kinds of things. Northwest Mounted Police officers will lose all of their horses in a thunderstorm, and all the horses flee to the United States. And so the Northwest Mounted Police officers are saying, you know, like, I need this horse. Like, I'm just going to straight die. And so what they do is they set their guns down at the border, to try and be like, we're not an invading army and we're going to go find our horses, right? And so you can see all of these challenges where people are trying to keep the sanctity of the border as tight as they can, but the natural world just isn't cooperating. And this is especially true in water borders. Water has this awful habit of getting foggy and stormy, and you can't actually see where you are. And suddenly you end up on the wrong side of the border. And smugglers will use this all the time to say, oh, I'm so sorry, there was a storm. I don't know how I got here with all of this illegal cargo. But there's also people who legitimately get trapped doing this, right? Like you can have your ship seized by accident just by drifting a little bit across the line. And so there's this wonderful environmental history to be done there with animals and rivers and oceans, but maybe for a different time.
You answered all these questions, and I sort of felt like everything we needed to know about the border we now knew, and then you just open it up with all kinds of other possibilities. So thank you so much for an incredibly engaging lecture and such a generous Q&A, and I think we'll all take you up on your offers of resources. It's incredible. I also want to say a big thank you to our online audience and to everyone who came in person. It is so nice to be able to gather and share space and learn from somebody such as yourself, Dr. Hoy. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming and braving the cold. And next week we have Dr. Jean-François Loisier, who's here in the audience tonight, speaking on Tuesday night, so a different day, but hopefully many of you will be able to join again. There are lots of snacks in the back for those of you who are in person. Hopefully the Zoom audience also has snacks at the ready. So please stay and enjoy, and please join me in thanking Dr. Hoy again for
I looked and I was like, this one's full again.